Popular crime shows portray the Bender family as supernatural monsters who vanished into thin air after killing dozens of travelers. The reality documented in 1870s Kansas newspapers and court records is somehow more disturbing than the legend. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep dives into the Wild West, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more shocking stories tomorrow. Also, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The Bender family has been called America's first serial killer family. Television shows, books, and documentaries have turned them into mythical monsters. Kate Bender is portrayed as a witch with supernatural powers. The family is said to have killed up to 50 people. They're described as vanishing mysteriously, never to be found despite massive rewards and nationwide manhunts. But when you examine the actual historical records preserved by the Kansas Historical Society, contemporary newspaper accounts from 1873, and court documents from Labette County, a different story emerges. One that's more complex, more frustrating, and ultimately more revealing about frontier justice than any supernatural tale. Here's what we actually know. From late 1871 to early 1873, a family operating an inn and general store along the Osage Mission Trail in southeastern Kansas murdered at least 11 travelers. We know this because 11 bodies were found buried on their property in May 1873. The actual number may have been higher, but 11 is what the physical evidence confirms. The family consisted of 4 people: John Bender Sr., his wife Elvira, their daughter Kate, and a younger man identified as John Bender Jr. They purchased property along a heavily traveled route and operated what appeared to be a legitimate business. For roughly 16 months, they systematically murdered guests, stole their possessions, and buried the bodies behind their cabin. When their crimes were discovered in May 1873, the family had already fled. Despite significant rewards totaling $3,000, numerous reported sightings, and arrests of suspected family members over the following decades, they were never definitively captured. Multiple people were arrested and brought back to Kansas, but witnesses who had known the Benders confirmed these were not the same people. This is where the mythology begins to diverge from documented reality. The supernatural elements, the inflated body counts, the mysterious vanishing all came later. The contemporary accounts from 1873 describe something simpler but no less disturbing. Opportunistic criminals who murdered for profit and escaped because 1870s law enforcement lacked the tools to catch them. Understanding what actually happened with the Benders requires separating 3 things. First, what we can prove through physical evidence and contemporary documentation. Second, what became legend through later sensationalized retellings. And third, what remains unknown because the evidence simply doesn't exist. The story matters not because it's mysterious or supernatural, but because it reveals the reality of frontier crime and the limitations of frontier justice. The Benders weren't caught not because they had special powers or vanished mysteriously, but because they benefited from the technological and organizational limitations of 1870s America. Over the next chapters, we'll examine exactly what the evidence shows, how the crimes were discovered, why the manhunt failed, and how the mythology grew to obscure the documented truth. The real story is more educational than any legend. Before we can understand what the Benders did, we need to establish who they actually were, based on historical records, rather than later embellishments. The documented facts are surprisingly limited, which itself tells us something about frontier record-keeping in the 1870s. Labette County land records show that in late 1871, property along the Osage Mission Trail was purchased in the name of John Bender. The property consisted of roughly 160 acres with a small cabin measuring 16 by 20 feet. This cabin served as both residence and inn, with a general store operation attached. The location was strategic, positioned on a heavily traveled route between Independence, Kansas, and Fort Scott. The 1870 Kansas census data for the area is incomplete, which was common for frontier regions. What we know about the family comes primarily from contemporary newspaper interviews with neighbors after the crimes were discovered. The Kansas City Times published detailed accounts in May 1873 based on interviews with people who had interacted with the family. 4 people operated the property. John Bender Sr., referred to in accounts as Old Man Bender, was described as somewhere between 50 and 60 years old. He spoke very limited English, primarily German, and neighbors noted he seemed to have little involvement in the inn's operation. Elvira Bender, called Ma Bender, was described as a large, intimidating woman who also spoke primarily German with heavy accent. The daughter Kate Bender, who called herself Professor Miss Katie Bender, spoke English more fluently. She was described in contemporary accounts as being in her early 20s, and she actively advertised herself as a spiritualist and healer. Newspaper advertisements she placed in Kansas papers claimed she could cure all sorts of diseases and communicate with the dead. These ads still exist in archived newspapers from 1872 and early 1873. The 4th person, John Bender Jr., presents a historical puzzle. Contemporary accounts describe him as being in his mid-20s, but his actual relationship to the family remains unclear. Some sources from 1873 suggest he may not have been related at all, but was using the Bender name. Others describe him as the son. The evidence doesn't definitively resolve this question. What's important to understand is that nothing about these documented descriptions suggests anything supernatural or exceptional. They were German immigrants running a frontier business. The spiritualism angle wasn't unusual. The 1870s were the height of the spiritualism movement in America. Hundreds of people advertised similar services in newspapers across the country. Kate's claims weren't remarkable for the period. Neighbors interviewed in 1873 described the family as mostly keeping to themselves, which also wasn't unusual for frontier families. They spoke accented English, which was common in areas with heavy German immigration. They seemed unremarkable until the murders were discovered. This ordinariness is crucial to understanding the case. Later accounts transformed them into obvious monsters, but contemporary descriptions show people who blended into frontier society. There were no warning signs that neighbors recognized before the discovery, no supernatural manifestations, no obvious criminal behavior that drew attention. The mythology that developed later added exceptional elements because ordinary criminals aren't as compelling for sensational stories. But the documented reality shows 4 people who looked like many other frontier families until their crimes were exposed. Understanding how the Bender murders actually worked requires examining the physical evidence found at the scene and testimony from at least one documented survivor. The method was brutally simple and effectively concealed by the inn's layout and frontier conditions. The cabin was divided by a canvas curtain that separated the residence area from the dining area where guests were served. Historical accounts preserved by the Kansas Historical Society describe the layout based on investigation after the crimes were discovered. Guests entering for meals would be seated at a table, positioned with their backs to the canvas curtain. While they ate, someone behind the curtain would strike them with a hammer, targeting the back of the skull. The coroner's examination of the 11 recovered bodies, documented in May 1873 reports, showed blunt force trauma to the head as the primary injury in most cases. Throats were then cut, likely to ensure death. The victims were robbed of money and valuables. Then their bodies were moved through a trap door in the floor to the cellar beneath the cabin. We know these details because at least one man survived an attack and provided testimony. Contemporary newspaper accounts from 1873 mention this survivor, though some details about his identity are unclear in the historical record. His account describes being struck from behind while eating, but managing to escape before the attack was completed. This testimony helped investigators understand the method when the bodies were later discovered. The cellar served as temporary storage. Evidence found during the investigation showed bloodstains consistent with bodies being kept there before burial. The family would later move bodies to graves dug in the orchard behind the property, where they were buried in shallow graves. The 11 bodies discovered in May 1873 were found in various states of decomposition, suggesting murders occurred over the 16-month period the family operated the property. Why was this method effective at avoiding detection? Several factors made it work. The location along the Osage Mission Trail saw frequent travelers, many traveling alone or in small groups. When people disappeared on frontier trails, it was commonly attributed to accidents, weather, bandits, or simply getting lost. A missing lone traveler didn't immediately suggest murder at a specific inn. The method itself was relatively quiet. Hammer blows didn't create the noise of gunshots that might alert passing travelers or neighbors. The attacks happened inside a private dwelling, where violence wouldn't be visible from outside. The canvas curtain concealed the attacker until the moment of attack, preventing victims from defending themselves or fleeing. The burial location in the orchard behind the property meant bodies were on the family's private land where casual visitors wouldn't go. The graves were shallow but sufficient to prevent immediate discovery. In an era before systematic missing persons investigations, bodies could remain undiscovered for extended periods. This wasn't sophisticated criminal genius. It was opportunistic murder enabled by specific frontier conditions: isolated location, frequent travelers, limited law enforcement, slow communication between settlements, and social acceptance that people sometimes simply disappeared on the frontier. The Benders exploited these conditions systematically. The physical evidence found at the scene confirmed this pattern. The trapdoor mechanism, bloodstains in the cellar, the positioning of the table relative to the curtain, and the burial sites all supported the documented testimony and coroner findings. This wasn't speculation. It was evidence-based reconstruction of what happened. The Bender murders might never have been discovered if not for one specific disappearance that triggered an organized investigation. Understanding how the crimes came to light reveals both the randomness of justice and the role that social status played in frontier law enforcement. In March 1873, Dr. William York disappeared while traveling from Independence to Fort Scott. Dr. York wasn't just another traveler, he was a physician and former Kansas state senator with family connections and resources. When he failed to arrive at his destination, his brother, Colonel Alexander York, initiated a serious search effort. Colonel York's investigation, documented in contemporary newspaper accounts, included visiting properties along the route Dr. York would have traveled. On March 28, 1873, he stopped at the Bender property. Multiple newspaper accounts from May 1873 describe this visit based on Colonel York's later testimony. The family's behavior during this visit increased rather than allayed suspicion. Kate Bender tried to use her spiritualist persona, claiming to have visions about the missing man's location. According to Colonel York's account published in the Kansas City Times, the family seemed nervous and evasive when questioned about travelers who might have stopped at their inn. This visit didn't immediately lead to investigation of the property, but it marked the Benders as persons of interest. Colonel York shared his suspicions with other families searching for missing relatives. By early April 1873, a pattern was emerging. Multiple people had disappeared along this route, and the Bender property was a common stop. On April 3, 1873, a community meeting was held in Cherryvale, documented in the local newspaper. The meeting organized systematic search parties to investigate properties along the trail and question operators about missing travelers. This level of organization was unusual for frontier investigations, but Dr. York's prominence created accountability that typical missing persons cases lacked. The search parties planned to systematically visit and search properties where travelers might have stopped. The Bender property was on the list, but before searchers arrived, the family disappeared. Sometime in late April, probably within a week of the community meeting, the Benders abandoned their property and fled. On May 4, 1873, search party members arrived at the Bender property and found it abandoned. The cabin was empty. Animals were gone. The inn was closed. Multiple newspaper accounts from May 1873 describe what happened next. A neighbor, Billy Toll, noticed disturbed earth in the orchard area behind the cabin and investigated. The smell of decomposition led to excavation. The first body found was identified through personal effects as Dr. William York. This discovery transformed the investigation from missing persons to murder. Further excavation of the orchard revealed 10 more bodies buried in shallow graves. The cellar beneath the cabin showed evidence of blood and the trapdoor mechanism that had been used to dispose of bodies. What's significant about this timeline is how close the Benders came to being caught in the act. Had the community organized just 1 week earlier, or had the family delayed their departure slightly, they would have been present when searchers arrived. The thin margin between escape and capture wasn't supernatural, it was timing and luck. The discovery triggered immediate manhunt efforts, but the family's week-long head start in an era of limited law enforcement communication would prove decisive. The physical evidence found at the Bender property provided investigators with detailed information about the crimes, while simultaneously revealing the limitations of 1870s forensic capabilities. What was found and what it revealed shapes our understanding of the case. The 11 bodies recovered from the orchard graves were examined by the county coroner, with findings documented in reports preserved in Kansas State Archives. The coroner's examination showed consistent patterns. Most victims suffered blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Several had their throats cut. The method was brutally consistent across multiple murders. Identification of victims proceeded through the methods available in 1873. Dr. William York was identified through personal effects, dental characteristics, and physical description matching his known appearance. George Launcher and his 18-month-old daughter were identified by family members who had reported them missing. William Jones was identified through belongings and clothing. Several other victims were identified through similar means. The victim profile revealed something important. Most were men traveling alone. Most appeared to be carrying money or valuables. Several were known to have been traveling with significant cash. This wasn't random killing. It was systematic robbery-murder targeting people who wouldn't be immediately missed and who appeared to have assets worth stealing. What's striking about the victim list is who wasn't on it. No wealthy travelers with large entourages. No groups of multiple people traveling together. No women traveling alone. The Benders apparently selected victims carefully, targeting those whose disappearance was least likely to trigger immediate investigation. The physical evidence at the property told its own story. The cabin showed signs of hasty departure. Food left on the table, personal items of no value abandoned. The canvas curtain that divided the room showed blood staining. The cellar beneath the trap door contained more blood evidence and signs of where bodies had been temporarily stored before burial. What the family took with them is as revealing as what they left. They took money, weapons, horses, and anything portable of value. They left behind furniture, heavy equipment, and anything that would slow their departure. Contemporary newspaper accounts from May 1873 note that neighbors estimated the family left approximately 1 week before the property was searched. This timing is crucial. The family clearly knew discovery was becoming more likely. The increased attention after Dr. York's disappearance, Colonel York's visit to their property, and the community organizing searches probably triggered their decision to flee. This wasn't mysterious vanishing. It was criminals fleeing ahead of imminent arrest. The evidence also revealed limitations. No photographs of the family existed. Physical descriptions varied among witnesses who had met them. The family had used their real names on property documents, but in an era before systematic identification systems, names alone were insufficient for capture. The 1-week head start meant they could be anywhere by the time the manhunt organized. What investigators couldn't find was also significant. No documents revealing the family's origins or previous locations. No correspondence indicating where they might flee. No associates who might harbor them. The family had apparently kept to themselves, creating no traceable connections beyond their immediate business. The physical evidence confirmed what had happened and provided victim identification, but it offered little help in catching the perpetrators who had already fled. The manhunt for the Bender family was immediate, well-funded, and ultimately unsuccessful. Understanding why requires examining what law enforcement could and couldn't do in 1873 America. The failure wasn't about incompetence, it was about systemic limitations that made catching fugitives across state lines nearly impossible. Once the bodies were discovered on May 4, 1873, the response was swift. Local law enforcement, Kansas state authorities, and private citizens launched pursuit efforts. Rewards totaling $3,000 were offered, documented in newspaper advertisements from Kansas, Missouri, and surrounding states. That's roughly $75,000 in today's money, a substantial sum that attracted numerous bounty hunters and private investigators. Telegraph messages were sent to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Contemporary newspaper accounts from May 1873 document the widespread publicity. Descriptions of the family appeared in dozens of newspapers across Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma Territory, and beyond. The problem was that physical descriptions were nearly useless for identification. Consider what investigators had to work with. No photographs of the family existed. Descriptions were vague. German-looking family, 2 older adults, 2 younger adults, speaking accented English. These characteristics described thousands of families across regions with heavy German immigration. Without photographs or unique identifying features, catching them required either someone who knew them personally recognizing them, or the family making obvious mistakes. The law enforcement structure of 1873 compounded the problem. There was no FBI or coordinated federal law enforcement. County sheriffs had jurisdiction only within their counties. No national database of criminals existed. No systematic way to share information beyond telegraphs and newspapers. Interstate pursuit required cooperation between agencies with no formal coordination system. The manhunt efforts were documented extensively in newspapers through 1873 and beyond. Dozens of reported Bender sightings occurred across Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma Territory, Texas, and as far as California. The Kansas Historical Society preserves records of investigations into many of these sightings. None were definitively confirmed. Several people were arrested on suspicion of being Bender family members. In most cases, arrested individuals were brought back to Kansas, where locals who had known the Benders examined them and confirmed they were not the same people. The most documented case occurred in 1889 when 2 women were arrested in Michigan on suspicion of being Ma and Kate Bender. Multiple witnesses who had known the family testified these were different people. Why couldn't law enforcement catch them? The honest answer is that they got enough head start in a time period when that head start was nearly insurmountable. By the time the manhunt organized, the family had at least a week to travel, possibly split up, change appearance, and disappear into a population of millions across a continent. Consider the practical realities. In 1873, a family could travel by train, wagon, or horseback. They could head in any direction. They could cross state lines or territorial boundaries with no checkpoints or identification requirements. They could change their names simply by claiming new identities. Creating a new life required nothing more than moving somewhere nobody knew you. The technology that would later make fugitive capture possible didn't exist. No fingerprint identification system. No photograph distribution network. No driver's licenses or social security numbers. No systematic record keeping across jurisdictions. The limitations weren't about lazy lawmen. They were about fundamental gaps in identification and tracking systems that wouldn't be addressed for decades. Once it became clear the Bender family wouldn't be caught immediately, theories about their fate proliferated. Distinguishing between documented claims and speculation is essential for understanding what we actually know versus what people wanted to believe. The first major theory claimed vigilante groups caught and killed the family within weeks of their flight. Several Kansas newspapers in 1873 published stories claiming this, though details varied wildly between accounts. Some claimed the family was hanged, others said they were shot. Locations mentioned included Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, and Texas. The problem is that no bodies were ever produced, no verified witnesses came forward, and the supposed vigilante group members were never identified. The Kansas Historical Society's assessment, based on examination of these accounts, is that this theory lacks credible evidence. It became popular because it provided satisfying closure. Communities wanted to believe justice was served even if official law enforcement failed. But satisfaction doesn't equal evidence. Modern historians studying the case generally dismiss this theory as wishful thinking. A second theory suggests the family split up and disappeared into new identities. Given the documentation limitations of the 1870s, this was entirely possible. Census records show millions of immigrants with similar backgrounds to the Benders. Creating new identities required nothing more than moving somewhere nobody knew you and claiming a new name. No birth certificates, social security numbers, or photograph identification systems existed to contradict false identities. Historians consider this theory plausible but unprovable. The evidence neither confirms nor refutes it. It remains speculation based on what was possible rather than documentation of what actually happened. A third theory claims they fled to Mexico or Canada, beyond U.S. law enforcement reach. Both countries had large German immigrant populations where a family speaking German wouldn't attract attention. The Mexican border in 1873 was largely uncontrolled. Travel to Canada was straightforward. Multiple newspaper accounts from the 1870s and 1880s reported sightings in both countries, but none were verified. This theory has the advantage of explaining why no confirmed sightings occurred in the U.S., despite extensive searching. It has the disadvantage of having no documentary support, its possibility presented as explanation. A fourth theory suggests some or all family members died from accidents or natural causes during flight. Given mortality rates of frontier travel in the 1870s, this wasn't implausible. Disease, accidents, violence, and exposure killed travelers regularly. If the family died during flight, it would explain why they never resurfaced even after legal jeopardy diminished. No evidence supports this specifically, but statistically it was a dangerous era for travel. What do historians actually believe? Most acknowledge we simply don't know. The Kansas Historical Society's official position is that the family likely split up shortly after fleeing, created new identities, and lived out their lives in anonymity. This is speculation based on what was possible in the 1870s, not documentation of what happened. Why do so many theories exist? The proliferation reflects human discomfort with unsolved cases. We want closure and answers. When evidence doesn't provide them, speculation fills the gap. Understanding that most theories about the Benders' fate are speculation rather than documented history is crucial for honest historical analysis. The evidence tells us they fled. It doesn't tell us where they went or what happened afterward. Accepting that limitation is more historically honest than choosing a satisfying theory without evidence. The failure to catch the Bender family reveals fundamental truths about frontier law enforcement that Hollywood westerns rarely acknowledge. Understanding why the system failed requires examining what law enforcement could and couldn't do in 1870s America, and what that teaches us about frontier justice mythology. Frontier law enforcement in 1873 Kansas consisted of county sheriffs with limited budgets and jurisdiction that ended at county lines. There were occasional U.S. Marshals covering vast territories and informal posses organized for specific pursuits. What didn't exist was any form of coordinated state police, detective agencies focused on criminal investigation, or systematic information sharing beyond expensive telegraph communications. County sheriffs were often political appointments. Their primary duties were serving court papers, maintaining jails, and keeping order within their counties. Criminal investigation wasn't their main function. Pursuing criminals who fled the county was technically outside their jurisdiction and definitely outside their budgets. When the Benders fled Labette County, the local sheriff's practical ability to pursue ended at the county line. The technological limitations were equally severe. Consider what didn't exist in 1873. No fingerprint identification system that wouldn't be developed until the 1890s. No systematic criminal photograph distribution. No forensic science laboratories. No coordinated record-keeping across jurisdictions. Telegraph communication existed, but was expensive, slow, and depended on someone at the receiving end taking action on transmitted information. The descriptions sent by telegraph about the Benders were too vague to enable identification. German family, 2 men, 2 women, speaking accented English, described thousands of families across states with heavy German immigration. Without photographs or unique identifying features like distinctive scars or tattoos, catching them required incredible luck or their own mistakes. Why the Bender case specifically failed comes down to several factors working together. The family's timing was crucial. They fled before the manhunt organized, gaining at least a week's head start. They apparently planned their departure, taking valuables and leaving nothing that would slow travel. They may have split up, making them even harder to track. Most importantly, they benefited from an era when identification systems were primitive and interstate pursuit was nearly impossible. Compare this to other frontier criminals who were caught in the same era. Jesse James was captured because he stayed in areas where he was known and continued criminal activity that drew attention. Billy the Kid was caught because he remained in a limited region where lawmen knew him. Wild Bill Longley was captured because witnesses identified him in areas he was familiar with. The pattern is clear. Criminals caught in this era made specific mistakes like staying where they were known or continuing crimes that created patterns. The Benders apparently avoided these mistakes. If they split up, changed names, moved to new regions, and stopped killing, they would be nearly impossible to find. This isn't mysterious. It's practical application of what was possible given technological limitations. Hollywood portrays frontier justice as efficient. Posses always catch outlaws, lawmen always get their man. Justice inevitably prevails. The Bender case reveals reality. Frontier law enforcement was overwhelmed, underfunded, uncoordinated, and technologically limited. Criminals who fled quickly and didn't make obvious mistakes often escaped permanently. This isn't about incompetent lawmen. The sheriffs and marshals who searched for the Benders worked within impossible constraints. The system itself lacked the tools that would later make fugitive capture routine. The Bender story told in 1873, newspapers was disturbing but straightforward. Family murders travelers for profit, flees before arrest, escapes capture. By the 1890s, that story had transformed into supernatural horror tale. Understanding how and why the mythology grew reveals how true crime sensationalism works and why accuracy matters. Contemporary newspaper accounts from May and June 1873 describe the case in relatively factual terms. The Kansas City Times, Independence Reporter, and other regional papers documented the discovered bodies, the investigation, and the manhunt. Body counts were reported as 11 confirmed victims based on physical evidence. The murder method was described as hammer blows followed by throat cutting. Kate's spiritualist advertisements were mentioned as background, not supernatural manifestation. The family was described as German immigrants who operated an inn and kept mostly to themselves. Their disappearance was attributed to fleeing before arrest, not mysterious vanishing. The 1873 accounts read like crime reporting, not horror fiction. They presented disturbing facts without excessive embellishment. By the 1890s, dime novels and sensationalist publications had dramatically transformed the story. The Kansas Historical Society documents this evolution through their collection of publications about the case. Each retelling added elements that made better fiction, but worse history. Kate Bender became a witch with supernatural powers. Stories claimed she could predict deaths, cast curses, and perform magical rituals. The body count grew from 11 confirmed to 20, 30, even 50 in some accounts. The cabin became a torture chamber with secret passages and hidden rooms. The family's disappearance became mysterious vanishing rather than simple flight from justice. None of these embellishments had basis in the 1873 evidence. They were additions designed to sell newspapers and dime novels. The late 1800s had a thriving true crime publishing industry that sensationalized cases to maximize sales. Basic facts weren't entertaining enough. Publishers added supernatural elements, inflated statistics, and created dramatic details that original investigations never documented. Why did the mythology grow so extensively? Several factors contributed. The lack of resolution created space for speculation. Without confirmed capture or death of the family, storytellers could create whatever ending seemed most satisfying. The mundane reality that they probably disappeared into new identities wasn't emotionally satisfying, so alternatives were invented. The spiritualism angle provided ready material for supernatural embellishment. Kate's advertisements claiming healing powers and communication with the dead were exploited by later writers who transformed commercial spiritualism fraud into actual supernatural abilities. This made better horror fiction even though it completely misrepresented documented reality. The victims being robbed and murdered wasn't dramatic enough for sensational publications. Stories added torture, prolonged suffering, and elaborate cruelty that coroner reports didn't support. The simple brutality of hammer blows became elaborate murder rituals in later retellings. Modern books, television shows, and podcasts about the Benders often split the difference between documented facts and sensationalized legend. They present supernatural elements as what people believed while acknowledging documented reality. But this middle ground can still mislead audiences about what actually happened versus what's entertaining speculation. The evolution from 1873 factual reporting to 1890s sensationalism to modern semi-fictionalized accounts demonstrates how true crime mythology develops. Each generation of storytellers adds elements that make better entertainment, gradually burying the documented facts under layers of embellishment. Why does accuracy matter for historical cases? Because the Bender murders are significant for what they actually reveal about frontier crime and law enforcement limitations. That significance gets lost when the story becomes supernatural horror tale disconnected from historical reality. Stripping away decades of mythology and sensationalism, what does the Bender family case actually teach us about frontier America, criminal investigation, and how history gets distorted? The documented facts reveal truths more important than any legend. Here's what we actually know based on historical records. Between late 1871 and early 1873, 4 people operating an inn in Labette County, Kansas, murdered at least 11 travelers for robbery. The crimes were discovered in May 1873 when 11 bodies were found on their property. The family had fled approximately 1 week earlier. Despite substantial manhunt efforts, rewards totaling $3,000, and numerous investigations over following decades, they were never definitively captured. These facts are supported by contemporary newspaper accounts preserved by the Kansas Historical Society, coroner reports from 1873, witness testimony, and physical evidence from the crime scene. Everything beyond these documented facts is speculation, later embellishment, or entertainment fiction presented as history. What does this reveal about frontier crime? The Bender case demonstrates that serial murder motivated by financial gain existed in frontier America. The isolation, transient population, and limited law enforcement of the frontier created opportunities for such crimes. The case also shows that detection was largely accidental. The murders were discovered not through systematic investigation, but because one victim with resources and connections disappeared, triggering organized search efforts. Other victims who lacked such connections went unnoticed. This suggests similar crimes probably occurred elsewhere on the frontier, but were never discovered or documented. The Benders weren't exceptional criminals. They were opportunistic killers who exploited specific frontier conditions until chance discovery exposed them. What does this teach us about frontier justice? The failure to catch the Benders, despite obvious guilt, physical evidence, and significant effort, demonstrates the severe limitations of 1870s law enforcement. Hollywood's portrayal of efficient frontier justice is mythology. The reality was fragmented jurisdiction, primitive identification systems, no interstate coordination, and overwhelming difficulty catching criminals who fled quickly. The Benders weren't caught not because they were criminal geniuses or had supernatural powers, but because they got enough head start in an era when that advantage was nearly insurmountable. This wasn't exceptional. It was typical of law enforcement limitations that enabled numerous criminals to escape in this period. What does this reveal about how history gets distorted? The evolution from 1873 factual reporting to sensationalized legend demonstrates how true crime mythology develops. Lack of resolution created space for speculation. Publishers added supernatural elements and inflated details to sell newspapers and books. Each retelling moved farther from documented evidence toward entertaining fiction. Modern retellings perpetuate this distortion when they present the Benders as mysterious supernatural figures who mysteriously vanished. This mythology obscures the historically significant reality: ordinary criminals who murdered for profit and escaped because frontier law enforcement lacked tools to catch them. Why does distinguishing fact from legend matter? Because the documented Bender case teaches us about frontier crime realities, law enforcement limitations, and how justice systems evolved. Those lessons get lost when we accept sensationalized versions instead of examining historical evidence. The case contributed to recognition of law enforcement needs that led to systematic improvements: interstate communication systems, photograph distribution networks, fingerprint identification, coordinated investigation capabilities. Understanding what actually happened and why the system failed helps us appreciate how criminal justice systems developed. The final educational takeaway is this: the Bender family case matters not as mysterious supernatural tale, but as documentation of frontier crime reality and systemic limitations that enabled it. The evidence clearly shows what happened: opportunistic murder, accidental discovery, and escape enabled by technological limitations. That's not mysterious. It's history. And understanding history honestly, rather than through sensationalized mythology, is how we actually learn from the past. If separating documented truth from true crime mythology changed your perspective on frontier history, subscribe for more analysis that examines what actually happened rather than what makes entertaining stories. Next week, the documented reality of frontier medicine that proves you should be grateful for modern healthcare. The evidence will shock you.